Well, welcome back to In the Word and Theofaith. So, what we're doing today is the next installation of our study in Revelation will be in chapter 2. We'll be beginning there and we'll get into it in just a second. So, we'll see how far we get. Just wanted to welcome you if you're new to Theofaith. I have basically three video casts I do. This one, which is weekly, which is our study through the book of Revelation. I usually keep it to about an hour, maybe a little less, a little more, but right around an hour. Then I have a 15-minute daily, near daily video. We're going through the Psalms this year, so we usually go through some large section of the Bible. We've gone through the whole Bible in a year. We've gone through the major prophets in a year and the minor prophets in the year. This time we're going through the book of Psalms, and usually 3 or 4 times a week on that. And then I'll have some periodic video casts out of particular topics of interest that may be relevant to either Revelation or Psalms, or something that just seems to be an issue that should be addressed. So those are the three things I do on this channel. I appreciate you being here and appreciate your prayer support and your financial support as well if you choose to do that. There's a link in the show notes below where you can give to the ministry, and also just pray for my insight and understanding and ability to be able to teach God's word. So thank you for that. So let's get into it today. We are in the book of Revelation. Let me switch over to my screen here so you can see what I'm looking at. We're going to be covering a number of things in this chapter. We'll be looking at how Jesus introduces himself, and then we'll review these churches that he's speaking to. I'll make some general observations and address the question, why these particular churches? And then we'll get into the individual churches themselves, starting with the church at Ephesus, a really important church, a seminal church in Asia, as well as a very, very influential church in Asia. So we'll be getting into that. Big picture, where we are in the book is that we are just finished the things which John had seen. That's in chapter 1. Here we move to the things which are. So these are the things that were existing in John's day. We take this to the mid to late 90s. And he's going to address this letter. This book of Revelation is a letter. And 7 copies were made and distributed to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, which we'll be talking about. So that's the section we're in. It's still a historical section. And we see here, as we discussed last time, Jesus's care for the church, his love for the church, his care for it, his watching out for the church, his warning it, his desire for the church to be all that it should be. In Revelation 1, we saw Jesus introduced last time and noted how his appearance really echoes what we see in Daniel from the Old Testament. And his appearance makes it clear that as John sees him, he is not only physically present before John, but also glorified and exalted before him. So this is not the same Jesus who John laid his head against in the Last Supper. This is the glorified, exalted Christ that causes John to fall down on his face before him. We see Jesus revealed here in his threefold office as prophet. This is his revelation. And when we get into chapters 4 and beyond, it's prophetic particularly, but the book as a whole is prophetic. We see Jesus as priest, interceding with the church and interceding for the church. And ultimately, we see Jesus revealed as king in this book. He's bringing his kingdom to the earth. Jesus has, just as he has 3 offices, he has 3 tasks. He comes as judge. He comes as judge of the church, is what we'll see today, as later the judge of the whole world. He comes not only as judge, but also jury. He makes the final decision. He sentences the fallen and the lost, and he is the executioner. This is not Jesus meek and mild. This is Jesus that comes on a white horse, bringing judgment to the earth, bringing the end of rebellion to the earth. So this is ultimately a message to the church. You'll see it's not only to these 7 churches, but you and I as well. Comes from our risen, exalted prophet, priest, and king, who in this book is standing ready. He is on the balls of his feet, so to speak, leaning forward, ready to bring judgment to the church as well as judgment to the earth. See these 7 churches in Revelation 2 and 3. I encourage you to come up with or find just a name to help you remember what these churches are like, what we can learn from them and to avoid as well as to emulate. I think I took these from Mark Hitchcock and his teaching in the book of Revelation. Don't mind giving my sources. I am ultimately a beggar. I am begging from other teachers in the history of the church to teach me, and I pass that along to you so you see how these churches are characterized. Today we'll be looking at Ephesus, as I said, the loveless church. But I just want to emphasize, as I did last time, when we're talking about church here, we're talking about a visible gathering of believers in a specific location. So this is the local church. Just as you and I are involved in a local church, this is a local church that Jesus has picked out, that Jesus is going to address, and we're going to see Jesus's deep, deep care and concern about the local church. I can't emphasize this enough as we go through these sections. Sometimes we talk about the universal church, the church of all the believers that have existed from Pentecost till today. Sometimes we talk about the visible church, all the churches that hang their shingle out, meet every Sunday, some meet on Wednesdays, that are active in the world today and in our cities and neighborhoods. Here in Estes Park, where I live, it's a very small town, 25 churches here, local churches. Some are good, most of them are bad, but 25 local churches. And your local church, your assembly of believers, whether it's several thousand or several hundred or just a dozen, this is the local church that Jesus cares about, that he's present in, that he knows what's going on, and he has more than an opinion, he has an assessment and direction. Let me point out again, I think we've looked at this map before. I think it helps me anyway, to orient ourselves what we're talking about. Patmos there in the lower left-hand corner, that island off the coast of what is now Asia Minor. That's the Aegean Sea there. Ephesus is this first church that we're going to talk about and that the Lord talks about. And this is a church that very, very influential in this area. In fact, what we know from church history is that these other churches, Smyrna and Pergamum and Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, were most likely the result of the ministry in Ephesus. So these churches were most likely the result of evangelists and pastor teachers going out from the Ephesian church and planting these churches around Asia Minor. So it's very significant church, very important church, and the church that's addressed first. Pointed out as well that this is following a road that goes through that area. So it's these angels or messengers, as I said before, and we'll talk about that in a second again. These messengers take the letters to these churches They're taking a boat from Patmos to the coast, likely coming ashore in Ephesus, and then following the Roman road that takes them to these other churches. Get some general observations about these churches before we get into the details. Two of the seven churches receive no condemnation from the Lord, just 2 out of 7. The other 5 all have issues, and I think issues that are in some way beneficial for us because we see and learn how to handle issues that we're likely to see in our own local body. Most of these churches, 5 out of the 7, are a mix of wheat and tare. And Jesus warned us in Matthew 13 that this was going to be the condition of the churches until he comes back. That there'll be wheat and tares, there'll be true believers, and there'll be false believers in all the churches. When I'm teaching like this online or when I'm teaching a group face-to-face, I usually have in my mind that there's wheat and tares that are mixed, that I'm speaking to the wheat. But even among the wheat, there's going to be a division. There's going to be those people who are just in love with the Lord, in love with the work he's doing, supportive of the church, the mature believers who know the word and are striving to live by the word. So these are going to be the mature believers, what John calls the fathers, I think. There'll be another group within the same church among the wheat that are believers that are growing. They may be young believers. They may be believers that have been in the church for a long time, but for one reason or another are just now starting to really grow and mature. And then there's those believers in the church that are what I would call carnal, that are believers in name, but have not yet taken their faith serious, maybe is the way to put it, are not yet taking their faith and applying it to their lives at home, perhaps their moms and dads, or perhaps they both work outside the home as well, so they're not applying it to their workplace, not applying it to how they live day to day. So there's that group of people. There's the mature, there's the growing, there's the carnal, the ones that are not yet bowing their knee, I'd say, to the Lord. And then they are the baby Christians, those ones that need to be nurtured by milk and not solid food. Perhaps they've been believers for a long time and just have not grown in their faith. And these are the divisions that we find in the church, and these are the divisions that are in your church, and these are the divisions that we're going to see in these 7 churches that we're going to look at here. So let's not go into this thinking that church is this ideal society of born-again believers and everyone's getting along and everyone's growing. It's far from it. That's not the reality of the church. We can also say that for those of us who are in the church that are growing and mature, our job is to help those others to reach that growth and maturity, either by our words and by our example both, and to love them and to love Christ as well. So that's our calling. I think all the churches you'll see are called to hear the messages to all the other churches. So when we hear of the church in Ephesus and we see the things they're doing well, then the other churches can hear this and say, hey, we're doing that well as also. And they can take encouragement from that the Lord knows that and he loves it. When they see what the church in Ephesus is doing bad, they should sit up and take note and say, are we falling alongside them? Are we weak in this area? We need to address something in this area. So all these churches are called to hear, and you'll see from my experience or my opinion that these are also messages to all the churches everywhere at all times. We'll see as we go through this that the biggest threats to this church are idolatry in the forms of false teaching and immorality. These are the biggest threats that occur if you could use just broad categories. Idolatry that manifests itself as false teaching and immorality, biggest threats that these churches face. Government, the legal system, the culture, the society, they're not really threats. But what's happening inside the church is really what Jesus is concerned about. Doesn't mean that the culture or the society around the church doesn't affect us. The sins of the culture often become the sins of the church, and we have to be on guard for that. But really, the biggest threats are inside the church. And finally, as we look at this, I'll just warn you, I guess, that Jesus' judgments are severe. He is not handling these churches with kid gloves. He is coming down on them and giving them severe warnings that they are to heed. So these are my general observations. I pray that you guys have looked through chapters 2 and 3 yourself and maybe came up with some general observations that you could add here. I'd love to hear that if you have things to add. We see a regular pattern to the way Jesus addresses these churches. He first talks about the commission of the messenger of the angel. So he addresses that messenger first. And then he introduces himself. And Jesus introduces himself just slightly differently to each of these churches, emphasizing some aspect of his appearance or his character that's particularly relevant for that church. And then in most cases, he has a commendation for the church. He tells them what they're doing well. He encourages them on what they're doing well. There is one exception, and we'll address that as we go through this. There's also a complaint. There's out of the 7 churches, only 2, Philadelphia and Smyrna. Jesus has no complaint for them. Interestingly enough, there are churches that are under persecution, active persecution, which tends to purify the church. Then he issues a correction and a call to repentance, and he gives them an encouragement or a comfort. So we see this over and over as Jesus goes through these churches. And, you know, if you are attempting to be I don't even want to say a leader in your church, but if you are attempting to influence your church, and you'll see that it's all of our responsibilities. This is a good pattern. You know, on the basis of what do you bring the church a message of commendation and correction? You don't want to just roll in there saying everything that everyone's doing is wrong. You want to point out things that are good in the church and build on that. But you also want to be clear about what's going on, what the complaint is, and provide a way of correction. So if you are going to heed the words of the Lord as we go through this and be a force for good in your church, I think Jesus' assessment pattern is a good example for us on how to approach the church, approach the leadership, and try to make a positive difference in the church. I want to address the question now, why these churches? Why these 7 churches? Out of all the churches, for example, there is a church in Colossae, right? That's not addressed here. Out of all the churches in Asia Minor, why address these churches? Well, 3 theories have been offered to explain that. One is that it's just practical. These are real churches. They are literal historical churches. They're existing in these cities. They're handy, and Jesus wants to address them. So there's this practical effort here. He needs to send messengers. He's going to send messengers to these churches that are along this Roman postal route So there's just this immense practicality of picking these churches. There's also this sense of the churches are perennial. That is, they are representatives of different kinds of churches that exist at the same time all over the world throughout church history. That these churches are going to have strong points and weak points that every church, everywhere and every time is going to have. So when Jesus says at the end of each church, he that has ears to hear, let the Spirit say, hear what the Spirit says to the churches, he is speaking to everyone, everywhere, at all times. And then some have suggested that there's a prophetic aspect of this, that the seven churches actually represent 7 stages of church history. So those seem to be the 3 reasons most people understand why these churches were picked. The church history, stages of church history view comes out like this. Everybody has just a slightly different take on that. So the early church, the reformers that were writing in the 1500s, they would look and they saw that the churches that were being addressed, they didn't look back and say these are the apostolic and the persecuted church, as much as everything looked to them like it was the official Roman Catholic Church. After all, that was what the Reformation was reforming, right? They were trying to reform the Catholic Church. So depending on where you're at in history, your view might be a little different, which is what I think is to be one of the weaknesses of this view. Another one is that in Revelation 1:19, which is our verse that gives us the outline of the book of Revelation, the section we're in are the things which are, not the things that'll be. So this is not a section of the book of Revelation that's talking about the future. This is not foretelling as much as it is forthtelling in the prophetic sense. This is God's word to the churches that are. And as I said, the churches that will be everywhere at all times. Also, there's really nothing in chapters 2 and 3 that suggests these should be understood as stages. It's unlikely the readers that first heard this, the reader of the church at Ephesus, when he was reading it to the church there, very unlikely that church would say, oh, we're the first stage of the history of the church in the world. They would never have understood it like that. The other objection I have to this view is that there's really no way to divide the 7 stages. Commentators that take this view divide the church history up in various ways. Very few of them agree. They have different views, and I think that confusion and that about how to divide church history shows that this is not an accurate way to understand these churches. And I'd also say that that view is really oriented toward the Western church. That is the church in Europe and England and the United States. Doesn't fit the global church. Doesn't fit what's happening in the churches in Africa right now, what's happening in the churches in the Middle East, what's happening in the church in China, the underground church there, which is thriving. Really doesn't fit that model of the global church. And finally, it destroys the doctrine of imminency, which we talked about last time. Now, the doctrine of imminency means that Jesus could return at any moment. He could return, hopefully he will, before I finish this particular video cast. Certainly, perhaps he will return before I finish this series. But the doctrine of imminency says that he can return at any time. And this pattern, if we understand this as a pattern of church history, it means Jesus can't return, you can slide back here, until sometime after the modern period. He was delayed because this is telling a prophetic history of the church, and we know that it's got to come true if it's prophetic, right? So that just doesn't make sense that Jesus's imminency would be delayed by this prophecy, especially after he told us that the things that are in this book will soon take place, that they could happen at any time. So I personally reject that. If you believe that, we can still be buddies. It's not a heresy, but I just don't think there's much evidence to support that kind of teaching. So I would say that these churches are picked because they're both practical and perennial. They are practical in the sense that these are churches that could be reached by these messengers that Jesus had a message for, and perennial, which means that the things that we see in these churches are going to exist in every church, every place, every time. So we're going to jump into Ephesus here, the church in Ephesus, a loveless church. Just to emphasize the fact that this is, again, a real church in a real place. Here's some photographs of Ephesus. This is the stadium that is in Ephesus, a prominent feature of the ruins of that town. This is the stadium where the artisans of Artemis gathered together to complain about the church that was upsetting their trade there. You can read about these things in the book of Acts. Here's the main street in the town of Ephesus. Paul certainly would have walked down these cobblestones, as well as many other prominent church figures would have walked along this road. This road would have led out of town to the other 6 churches that were going to get messages from the Lord. Here's the remains of a late memorial. I think this was to the Apostle John, who's writing the book of Revelation. John was a leader of the church in Ephesus himself. So let's get in it. If you've got your Bible, pull it in front of you there so you can follow along. If you don't have it, it'd be a good time to stop the video. Just put it on pause for a minute while you go get your Bible and then come back. I'm turning to my own page. And we see verse 1, to the angel of the church in Ephesus. So the angel, angelos here, is either an angel or a messenger. It's translated both ways in the New Testament. It's a supernatural being or a human being. So the John the Baptist is called an angelos, an angel, a messenger, in the Gospel of Luke. When you look in the Gospel, in John's writing, so the Gospel of John in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, it's always used of supernatural beings. So John always uses it in supernatural beings. But I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to suggest that the context here points to the fact that this is actually a group of human messengers that are being sent out. These are the bond servants from Revelation 1:1, which we'll look at. And specifically, I'd say these are elders or pastors of the churches that Jesus is addressing. So John, as I said, on the Isle of Ephesus, on Patmos, summoned them. He was the leader of the church in Ephesus for a long time, had apostolic authority, so that when he summoned the leaders of these churches, they came to Patmos. So if we go back to Revelation 1:1, we see this, what I'd call a chain of custody, I guess, a chain of revelation that goes from God, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him. So it goes from God in heaven to Jesus to show his bond servants the things which must soon take place. And he sent and communicated it by his angel to his bondservant John. So you see this chain of custody starts in heaven with God, goes to Jesus, subordinate to God in terms of his mission, but not his person. His task, what they call that, the economic Trinity. They have different jobs within the Trinity, so Jesus is subordinate to the Father in that sense. And then Jesus passes this to an angel who brings the revelation to John the Apostle. John the Apostle, in turn, provides it to Jesus's bondservants. I think those are the angels of 2:1, the earthly bondservants, the pastors and leaders of those churches. So you can see the context here kind of indicates that the revelation comes from heaven, goes to earth, it's handed off to the pastors and elders of the churches, and they carry it to all the churches, in this case, Ephesus, the church in Ephesus. And as I said, and I want to emphasize, this is a group of local believers, just like where you go to church. These are a group of probably a small group. We know that because of the architecture, that churches which met in homes at that time, you could probably get about 10 or 12 people comfortably in an individual home. And then perhaps prominent people in the city had larger homes so that when these home groups or these home churches met periodically, they gathered together in a larger home that could accommodate 50 people. So let's say that this church in Ephesus was being addressed, and maybe they had 50 or 60 people in the church. They're going to hear this letter read. These are a church that's shepherded by qualified elders. We see the qualifications in Acts and 1 Timothy and Titus, but there are qualified elders leading these churches, just as I pray you are in a church with qualified men who are leading it. And these churches, just like you, are observing the ordinances of the church, the baptism, the Lord's Supper, ministry of the Word, and where necessary, church discipline is being enacted. As we'll see in Ephesus, it was. When we look at this particular church, you can read about it in Acts 18 through 20. It's quite the long period of time that Paul spent ministering there. So it's considered an apostolic church. This particular letter is being written about 30 to 35 years after Paul wrote the letter to the church in Ephesus. And you'll see some significant changes that have happened from Paul's letter to what's going on in the church today. And let me tell you, this church had really good leadership. It was planted with really good leadership. Priscilla and Aquila first came there and established the church, perhaps just a small Bible study until Paul came. A man named Apollos, who was discipled by Priscilla and Aquila, a very capable teacher, according to the book of Acts, was also there. And then, of course, the Apostle Paul came and taught there for 3 years. He handed that work off to Timothy in 1 Timothy. And then John, the Apostle, was also a leader. So they had really good shepherds in this church in the early days. And kind of makes us pause right now to reflect on that a little bit because, you often hear that there's no second generation Christians, really. So this is just one generation from that founding of the church. And what so often happens with Christian organizations, be they churches or parachurch organizations or even seminaries, is that the zeal, the fire, the love for the Lord and the love for people that was true in the early days of the church begin to wane into the second and third generations. Just came from a church that lots of great reminiscence of earlier days in the church where there was fire and passion, and we see that oftentimes. Maybe you're in a church like that now where you're wondering what's happened. There are a lot of churches around, and perhaps what we need to be doing is paying really close attention to what Jesus says to these churches to make sure that our local church doesn't go the same way. To go on here, he says, the one who holds the seven stars in his right hand and the one who walks among the seven golden lampstands. You know, sometimes people will look at these symbols and they'll say, well, what do these mean? Well, I think it's about 21 or 24 times. I put 24 on the slide here. I think that about 21 or 24 times the symbols that are used in the book of Revelation are interpreted or explained right there. And this is one of those cases. Back in chapter 1, verse 20, we know that the seven stars are the leaders, the angels of the churches. Jesus has them in his right hand. He's protecting them. He's powerful over them. He rules them. The seven lampstands are the seven churches. So what it's saying here is that Jesus is intimately involved in this church, and he's intimately involved in your church as well. He has your leader in his right hand. That leader, whether he realizes it or not, is under the authority of Christ, and Christ is powerful. That's why he's in his right hand. And he walks among those golden lampstands. He is present. He is watching what's going on. If he has not taken away that lampstand, he is there in the church and he knows what's happening. He knows what's going on. Jesus speaks to his people and he speaks among them. That's what he promised us in John 16:13. That the Spirit of truth, when the Spirit of truth comes, which he did at the day of Pentecost, he is going to guide you into all truth. He's speaking to the apostles here, the apostolic teaching, which has been handed down to the church. He says the Spirit will not speak on his own, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will disclose to you what is to come. That's what's happening here. Jesus is following through on his promise to the church that the Spirit is speaking. The Spirit is speaking through him to and among the people of the church. And Jesus is going to preserve them. He's going to take care of them. He says in John 6:39, I will not lose anyone that the Lord has given to me. So Jesus is there and he's on a mission. He wants his people to stand firm. And let me tell you, just as an aside or point of application, I kind of take this as the thrust of my own ministry, whether it's online or in person, whether I'm in a pulpit or in front of a Sunday school, or I'm teaching here as I am online, that my mission, my commission from the Lord is to preach and teach his word in order so that his people will stand firm. You know, we live in dark days of apostasy in the church. I'm speaking about in the church, where we need great discernment. And my goal and my mission is to help you, and me for that matter, stand firm in very difficult times. Jesus goes on here. He says, I know. Let me just stop you there for a minute. Jesus is not ignorant about what's happening in the church. He is not unaware. He knows what's happening, and he knows also the motivations behind it. He knows. He's aware. He says specifically here, I know your deeds and your toil and your perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men, and you put them to the test. I think there's 4 things that he's commending them here for. Number 1, their deeds. Ergon is the Greek word there. Don't be thrown by that. Means energy, activities, accomplishments. It points to the things that this church has done. They've been a faithful church. They've been a church planting church. They have been a disciple making church, not just in words, but they've actually carried it out. And they can prove it because they've planted other churches, churches that claim to be disciple-making churches that really don't have anything to show, like a church plant from them. Jesus knows that. He knows their deeds. He knows the claims of their deeds and the lack of accomplishment. We'll see that in one of the other churches. He knows they work hard. To toil, this kapos here means to work hard at something that's difficult, to expend blood, sweat, and tears, to pour your life into it. If you're in a church, and I pray you are, that if it's a hardworking church, ministry requires money, ministry requires space. So the church is not only, I don't know, unfortunately is the right word because I think the Lord planned it like this, but the church is raising money. The church raises funds to carry out the work of the ministry. That's just the way that God has designed it, and it's your opportunity to get involved. It's your opportunity to toil as well. He says that you cannot tolerate evil men, and you put them to the test, those who call themselves apostles. So to test something is to try to figure out what it is, or its character, or its nature, by checking it out, right? By taking action and testing it. We'll talk about false teachers and the signs, but they are looking, they're being careful, they are following up, they're checking references, we can say, and they are being very careful. I love that word. They cannot tolerate evil men. This is something that the church has chosen that they cannot do. Finally, perseverance. Perseverance, hupomone, is to bear up in the face of difficulty. Patience is to bear up under the difficulty, under difficult people. Perseverance, though, is difficult circumstances. And you can imagine the church in Ephesus weathering difficult circumstances. Ephesus was a center of pagan worship. It was a center of emperor worship at this time. Diocletian was being honored as a god. Part of it was just being trying to suck up, I guess, sycophant to Rome, trying to suck up to Rome. But they took pride, you can say, in the same way that we take pride in the local football teams. So if you're in Chicago, you're committed to the Bears. If you're in Dallas, you're committed to the Dallas Cowboys. There's a pride associated with your football team, or if you're a New York Yankees fan or the Mets. These are things you take pride in. Well, these cities took pride in their gods. And just like we take pride in our sports teams. And if you did not worship their gods, you were facing difficulties of all sorts, which we won't go through here. You've probably heard sermons about this before, but they were persevering, even though it was very difficult for them to continue. So they were a diligent church, thriving under adversity. They were very discerning. They put to the test those who call them apostles. They found them to be false. This is tremendous. If there's anything that we seem to lack in the local church today, it's discernment. Seems like a church will welcome anybody that's popular, anybody that can draw a crowd, anybody who can cause a liver quiver among the congregation. It seems to be what's looked for a lot. Real lack of discernment about the teaching and character of the people that are being brought in, that are being allowed to teach the church. I've been in several churches where the pastor has fallen to sexual immorality, elders are fallen to sexual immorality. And what's even worse is sometimes they're restored to their ministry after a certain period of time. Sometimes they're brought back to the ministry even though their character has been proven to be wanting. Doesn't mean that they're not a Christian. It doesn't mean that they can't be restored to fellowship of the body. But in my opinion, certain sins disqualify people from leadership and from being up front in a church. So that's what we see here is they're being discerning. And this means that that church was well taught, right? They knew their doctrine, they knew their Bible, they could spot somebody who was deviating from it, deviating from the teaching that the apostles had handed down. They were trained, they were well equipped. This is the job of the pastor teacher, to not only teach, but to equip his people to spot false apostles, to spot false teaching. If there's anything that's plaguing the church today, it's false teaching and the acceptance of it by people in the pew. And let me just again point out that Jesus is speaking to the whole church here. He's got a message for the whole church. This is a task for the whole church, not just the elders and the pastor, but anyone in the church. Everyone in the church actually should be taught and trained to spot and to object to false teaching. So what are some of the characteristics? So if we just open up a little bit and look at the rest of the New Testament, and I just did this afternoon in about 20 minutes, just went through 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Peter, and Jude, and picked out some characteristics of false teachers. And these characteristics are things that help us pick them out, help us mark them out. And there's basically two categories, moral characteristics and doctrinal characteristics. If you want to read the slide, I'll let you pause the video and you can read the slide yourself. I'll just highlight some things that are pretty common under moral. This motivated by money or being greedy is one evidence of a false teacher. And we see this at different levels of greediness and different desires for money from prominent health and wealth preachers asking for that God told them they need a jet, a personal private jet, to driving Rolls Royces and just outrageously expensive cars. There's even an Instagram channel called Preacher's Sneakers. It comments on the hundreds and I guess even thousands of dollars that some of these celebrity preachers will spend on their shoes, on their athletic shoes that they wear in front of the congregation. Another one is they are sneaky, they're secretive, they're subtle, they worm themselves in among the church. They come in and they've got the answer for every problem. They've got a solution for every need. They volunteer and insinuate themselves with the church before they spring their false teaching on them. Seems like we've ignored 1 Timothy, that it says not to put a new believer as an elder into the church. They despise authority. They're self-willed, and ultimately, when they're challenged, they will push back against the challenge from the pulpit or challenge from an elder. They will be their own authority and claim their own authority. Very often we see adultery, either outright sex with someone who you're not married to, or just flirtatious examples, suggestions, and crude talk and immoral talk that goes on between men and women that shouldn't be, especially particularly outside your marriage. We see them preying on the weak and needy. They'll get the weak sheep. They'll get those sheep that I was talking about before that are either the tares among the congregation or the new believers, the babies that are being nurtured on milk, or the weak or carnal believers who are just looking for someone to affirm them in their weakness, we could say. Also, we see them as complainers. They're fault finders. They never have anything good to say. They're always complaining. I'm reminded of Absalom standing near the gates of Jerusalem as people were going in and out, and he was undermining his father David by saying, well, if your legal matter before the king was, if I were king, I would decide it in your favor, or I would have done this, or I would have done that. And what he's doing is just complaining and fault finding. And we see a lot of these people in the church. They've got every complaint. They can point out every problem, and very rarely do they have a solution. These are false teachers. These are different kinds of false teachers. There's 7 different kinds. We're going to talk about that in a later session. Doctrinally, you got to know the Bible to know that they have an unbiblical and ungodly doctrine. You need to understand clearly what the doctrines are that the apostles handed down, particularly about the person and work of Jesus. 2 Peter 2:1 tells us that they deny even the sovereign Lord who bought them. They deny his person, they deny his work. So we have to be really well rooted in Christology, it's called in theology, the doctrines or the teaching about the person and work of Christ. It's got to be really convenient to us. We've got to have it in our mind, because I would say that almost every false teacher, as 2 Peter seems to say, almost every false teacher begins with a flawed view of Jesus. We see them mocking and denying the apostles' teaching. And what we see so much is denying the imminent return of Jesus. That is, denying the any moment, any time return of Jesus to the earth. We see that frequently among false teachers, a doctrine that they deny. So Jesus goes on. He continues to talk to them about their discernment and finding them to be false. And let me encourage you, brothers and sisters, that I know it's difficult to call out false teachers in a body. It's difficult to go to a pastor or go to an elder and bring to our attention that somebody who may be popular in the church and may have a big Sunday school, or even perhaps the pastor is wrong about something. And let me just encourage you from Ephesians. Paul warned this church, and they were apparently taking it serious. He warned them to let no one, sorry, I have my typo there, let no one deceive you with empty words. It's a command. He's telling them, don't be deceived. And he's talking to the church. He's talking to the people, not just in the front, but the people in the pew. 2 John, remember John is writing this Revelation. He's writing this down, and John had warned the church, probably the church in Ephesus, among these other churches, that if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, and if you go back and look at 2 John, he's talking about the apostolic teaching. He tells them, do not receive them into your house, which is, of course, where the church was meeting. Do not give him a greeting. And listen to this. It says, for the one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. Let that sink in for a second. If you're in a church that is tolerating false teaching, and you know the teaching is false, but you keep going, perhaps because your friends are there, maybe you've justified it in some way that maybe he or she doesn't teach very often, or he's got a good heart. I hear that all the time. Bible doesn't say we have good hearts, right? If you are tolerating that, you are participating in his evil deeds. In other words, Jesus is going to hold you accountable for that. I can't be more serious about this, and you may be turning me off right now, but just hang on for one more second. That this is important. That you need to speak up. And as one of my mentors once said, with regard to a church, everyone in a church votes either with their pocketbook or their feet. So if you are in that church and you are supporting that church's ministry financially, well, then you are participating in evil deeds if there's false teaching going on. Let that sink in. So this commendation, as I said, is for the whole church. The whole church is called to be on guard. The whole church is held responsible. And again, Paul warned the church, don't no one deceive you with empty words. This is to the whole church. The wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. This is serious. Jude 3, Beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity. Notice that word. The Holy Spirit moved him. I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing, asking you, begging you to contend earnestly for the faith, once and for all, handed down to the saints. Brothers and sisters, we've got to contend. We don't have to be contentious, but we have to identify when there's false teaching happening in the church, and then we have to take action. We have to move. If we can't have the false teaching repudiated and the false teacher disciplined, then we need to leave that church and not support the ministry of that church. And again, 2 John 11, I think I mentioned this already. So it's all of our responsibilities, brothers and sisters. It's my responsibility as best I can in a parachurch ministry to equip you and to encourage you and to help you stand strong and to encourage you to stand strong. And if I'm with you face to face or in a church ministry as a pastor and elder, my responsibility to help you stand firm in days of apostasy. And put this in your lap. It's your responsibility now. You need to take action. You need to do something. I see I'm coming up on 56 minutes, so I've been going on a while here. I'm going to stop it here. We'll stop at this commendation, and then we'll pick it up next time in what the Lord has to say to this Ephesian church. And again, pay attention. This is something that's going to happen in your church or churches in your area that you are going to be, because of this, equipped for, and I hope strong to stand firm. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, and may God's word dwell in you richly until the next time we look at this church in Ephesus.